My father had way more influence on me than I think he even knew or realized. Uh, but not because he wasn't keen and smart. He just didn't realize what was going on behind the scenes with me musically. Uh, I remember one of the things that he brought into the house for himself was he bought a really expensive tape player slash recorder. It was called a superscope, and I think at the time they were used by a lot by journalists who were using them for interviews. They recorded really well, and they also had something that he didn't even use, which was a speed control. They could slow the playback of a cassette tape down to, I don't know, probably 50%, and but he didn't even use that function. He was only concerned with just having a good sturdy machine that he could put his Winston tapes in and plug his earphone into it, and then he'd play along with those tapes. And of course we ended up using it for recording ourselves around the house, the boys playing and me playing and mother singing and playing the piano and whatnot, making tapes of house parties, which was that's a very Cape Bretonish thing to do, is make tapes of house parties. Uh, there's a close friend of mine who's a master of the guitar down in Halifax named Dave McIsaac, and he's renowned in the Celtic music world for owning, hundreds and hundreds of house tapes. That's what they call them, of different fiddlers, down like right way back to the 40s. He has wire recordings and reel-to-reel tapes, and people recorded themselves. When the technology became available, they were like, wow, let's record this for posterity or whatever, right? So I was allowed to touch this machine. I used it all the time, not only to listen to music on cassette, but to record myself, which was something that led to the insanity of my life for the next 40 years. And so my father bringing that particular piece of equipment into the household had a profound effect on my learning, because I started to put two and two together very early, like at the age of 5 and 6. I've been using the record player for years, since I was 3. And then, because my brother Joe was always so concerned with having the best component stereo he could possibly buy to get it, to afford, we ended up having a stereo system where you could put a blank cassette in the cassette component, and play a record and record it right onto the cassette. So then that cassette would be taken by me to the bedroom, put in this superscope tape player, and I would use it to rewind, and I would play, uh, you know, 8 or 10 notes. I would figure 8 or 10 notes out, then I'd stop it and practice the 10 notes, and then I'd let it play the next 10 and rewind. And I also had somebody bought me a turntable, a portable turntable inside this blue plastic suitcase, which was a total piece of shit. It sounded horrendously bad. And but I also used that I'd pick the needle up and play something for 10 seconds and lift it and play, and I would just sit there for hours and hours doing this. But the point was being that the superscope had two things. It was easy to use because it was one button, you could rewind music, and it slowed music down. I was blessed all my life with perfect pitch, so I didn't need. My father used to have a little round pitch pipe. It was circular, and it was a circular harmonica, and it had all the notes chromatic. It had all the notes and the notes in between the flats and sharps, and he used that to tune his fiddle. I didn't need that for some reason. I could hear standard pitch without even having anything to go by. And so what I would end up doing when I wanted to learn something is I'd put it in a cassette player and I'd slow it down, then tune my guitar down to wherever that was. So I ended up learning tunes with my guitar detuned, like probably 2 full tones, which this is another freakish thing, right? Because I had such bad guitars with heavy gauge strings on it, tuning down a whole tone made the action easier. So, because the strings were literally floppier because it was so low. And so I ended up, all of these components, all these coincidences led to me being able to learn stuff very easily, and my sharp ear gave me all these weird tools. I had this tape player that slowed down to half speed. I could tune my guitar down to it very easily. I knew, and another thing that I believe happened is that slowing down the recordings allowed me to hear more accurately what notes were being fretted on a guitar and what notes were open. And that is a massive, massive key to understanding how to play anything on the guitar, is which D note is being played. Is it the open D string? Is it D on the 3rd fret of the B string? Is it D on the 7th fret of the G string? On and on it goes. And slowing it down literally opened up the tonal qualities of each note, where I could discern where on the neck a note was being played. And this was all coincidence. I had no idea at the time how important that was. I just knew it was happening. And also the ease with which I could learn something. If it got too hard, I knew I was playing it in the wrong place on the neck. I don't know why I knew that either. But so Dad really hit it out of the park with that one. That piece of equipment single-handedly started something in my life that never ended. To have that system in place all the time, anytime I wanted it. There was another issue as well that started to present itself early in my life, and I didn't know. I had no idea that this was even a thing, or that it had a name, or any of those things, until I was well into my 40s, before a journalist asked me about it, and I had no idea what she was asking me because I didn't know what the word meant. She said it, and I was like, I don't understand. What do you, like, what do you, it was actually kind of funny. It was a phone interview, and she called me up, and the first question was, so I understand you have synesthesia. I thought it was a disease or something. I was like, "What, Jesus? What have you heard?" And I said, "What? I have what?" And she said, "Well, you see music in physical manifestations in your vision as shape and color." And I said, "Yeah, actually, yes, I do. I had no idea it had a name." My whole life, I think I was 46 or 47 when this information came to me. But this manifested in me when I was 6 years old. I remember the first time, I can still remember the first time it happened. I was listening to my father play the fiddle, and he played a tune in a Strasberg, a slow Strasberg, and when he started to play it, I saw this. This is going to sound really weird, but I saw this dark brown kind of piece of driftwood floating by my eyeballs. Like it was just like a, and then as time went on, it I say driftwood because it was almost like a rectangle or a trapezoidal kind of a shape, and and the more I heard the tune, the stronger the image came, and the sharper the edges of the image came, and it became a shape and a color, and then I started noticing that other things looked different. Certain chords were blues and circular, and other things were yellow, and they were triangles and circles, and or like wavy lines, or so like all there was all this thing going on in my head. When I was hearing music, I was seeing it, and I had no idea. I just thought that it was my imagination. I thought I had a vivid imagination, and that I could, that I was, that my brain maybe was. I mean, I was a kid. I wasn't thinking this deeply, and even through my adult life, I just thought, well, I visualize what I hear. Big deal, right? So it turns out that synesthesia is it's really rare, and it's a neurological issue that's usually attributed to mathematicians. Mathematicians see math in shapes and color, and but then again, music is mathematical. So, which is odd to me, is I never understood music theory, and probably still I don't really use it now. I understand enough to teach basic theory about what's going on in an instrument, but theory, when I look at music theory, synesthesia goes away. It blocks it somehow. I can't apply my musical knowledge or my synesthesia to music theory. So it's weird because theory is all mathematical. But this started to manifest in me at that early age, and to be honest with you, the I've always loved to teach people to play, and I've always loved to help people with everything they're doing musically, and I've always felt bad about the advantages I had, because I know in my heart and my head that somebody who wants to learn to play or improve their playing can do so to an unlimited level if they do it in the right way. But when I offer to teach people things, or I offer to teach them over time, or whatever the case may be, like, or if they sign up for my online courses, my online lectures, they all come at it sort of the same way. They tell me, well, I'll never be able to play like you, so I mean, what's the point? Like, I can't learn anything from you. It's too far advanced, or whatever the hell. And it always bothered me. I always felt bad. I was like, okay, so you didn't grow up with this bizarre set of circumstances in your life. You don't have synesthesia, so I can't teach you that. And but I've always wanted to tell them, take them by the shoulders and go, look, if you just do these few things, you can absolutely catch up to me in no time at all. But it's very hard to convince people of that, and it's been very frustrating in my life. I've always felt bad, because I've always wanted to teach people, and it's imperative to me almost that I pass on the knowledge that I fell into. So, yeah, it's odd. It's an odd, really odd set of circumstances that came together in this perfect storm that put me on all these different paths, and also allowed me to play more than one instrument, because that's also part of synesthesia, and because I can translate my ideas from one instrument to another without any thought. I can play something on the guitar, play the same thing on the mandolin. even though it's a different scale, different tuning, different everything. It's a visual overlap, an overlay of the information translates to whatever I'm holding. And that's probably a freakish ability too. I don't know. I'm not sure. But I mean, I wish it was something I could teach. I've tried to boil down what I do to the most understandable form, and which is basically just taking people through the step-by-step process that I accidentally went through as a child, and the little things that I learned that open all the doors. I've tried to do that. That's been a big thing for me. So there was, in those early days, besides all the other influences I described so far in the series, there was a particular guitar player that I had. There were 2 records in the house at that time of this guitar player, and of course, you just can't be a guitar player without mentioning this guy's name, and that name is Chet Atkins. It's unmeasurable when you think about, people who don't know about Chet, right? Who just think was maybe just a hayseed country guitar player, blah blah blah, Nashville, la di da. If you know what he actually did and accomplished in his career, and the millions of people that he inspired to go buy an instrument and start playing, it's immeasurable what he accomplished. There's just no way to measure it. If I can guarantee you that 90% of the world's guitar players will list Chet Atkins as one of their, if not their biggest influence. And some guitar players didn't even follow that path. They heard Chet play, and then they ended up not even being fingerstyle players, but they ended up being guitar players, and they took from his style what they needed to do their own thing. This is a man that made, I think, 228 or 230 albums in his career. 230 albums. It's just mind-boggling, like the amount of music that guy put out, and it was all incredible. There was nothing he ever did, in my opinion, that was fluff or just putting out music for the sake of putting it out. He had something to say with every record he ever made, every record. And there were 2 of his albums in my house. The first one was a double album set that my father, I think my father bought it. Maybe I'm wrong, but it could be Joe bought it. Probably was Joe. And it was a double album set on RCA Victor called This is Chet Atkins. And I remember seeing it for the first time. And there was this beautiful watercolor painting of Chet on the front. And it embodied and epitomized everything in my mind about being a guitar player. There was some serene, Zen-like thing in that painting, and it captured Chet, who Chet was, And the other album that was in the house at the same time was another RCA album, because, Chet, we can go into Chet Atkins for days and talk about what he did in his career. But at the time, he was working for RCA. They called RCA Records at that time the house that Chet built, because Chet had done wonders for the RCA stable and was a brilliant producer. for that record label and an A&R guy. And so there was this other record called Chet Atkins Alone. And that cover, too, was absolutely inspiring. It was a picture of him, I believe, in the one of the studios at RCA, all by himself with that big red Gretsch, sitting in a chair playing, and he was, the look, his body language and the way he was holding the guitar and the hands, and I used to listen to those albums incessantly. It just never ended for me. It never got old. And the more I listened, the more I learned, and I kept hearing all these things that he was doing that I was thinking, okay, I'm picturing this and I know what it is. And so that's when the superscope tape player came into play. Because I immediately I could tell by the look of the pictures of Chet that he was playing with his fingers and his thumb. There was no flat pick in his hand, which I'd seen my brother Joe use. So I knew it wasn't that. I'd never seen Joe wear a thumb pick. But I could see the thumb pick in these pictures. And so I knew there was a thumb pick and there was as many fingers. I don't know how many he was using, but there were more than one involved because of the complexity of what he was playing. And so I realized I could hear him playing the bass lines and the melody at the same time. So I figured, okay, well, my brain immediately went, we have to separate that. I wonder if I can do just part of that. So what I ended up doing was I went into my superscope tape player there and figured out the chord. I slowed down the recording, and I figured out the key changes and the stuff that was going on, and then I did something that was completely abnormal for a 7-year-old kid to do. I created my first overdub. I thought, how can I play both of these parts at the same time? Well, I can't right now, but I could separate them and play one of the parts on this tape deck and then play the tape deck back and play the other part along with the tape. And that's what I did. And it started out as the thumb part. I would play through the whole tune, just the thumb and the chord changes that I could hear him making. And then I'd stop that, rewind it, and play that back, and I would pick the melody with my fingers along with this recorded thumb. And deconstructing Chet that way taught me how to do it simultaneously, because I immediately could see what my fingers had to do while the thumb was moving. So I started to take things apart. It became two separate performances in my brain, the thumb and the fingers. They were separate. And that's how I learned to play fingerstyle guitar. It was an amazingly quick process. It only took me a few months to realize, okay, so when this note of the melody is happening, my thumb is here, because I had taken them apart. I even did it opposite. I played the melody. I recorded the melody on the tape and played with that with just the thumb. So I was able to. Somehow my brain knew that I had to take it apart. I had to make them separate, and I had to see where they rubbed against each other. That's the best way to describe it. I had to find out where this finger was when the thumb was doing this. And it was easy. If you take something apart at that level, it gets real easy. It's like, oh, okay, so while this is happening, and pretty soon the thumb, because the thumb is so repetitive, the thumb became automatic. And I immediately found all all of the patterns for each chord. They're easy, right, to do. You just find out where the root is on every chord, and it just went on from there. And so there was one particular piece of music that this happened in my life a lot too as well. There was one particular piece of music that occurred in our household from multiple sources. That tune, that song, was "Blowin' in the Wind." First of all, I heard it on an album, a Glenn Campbell album called "The Astounding 12-String Guitar of Glenn Campbell," and that album virtually changed my life as well. It was an incredible piece of music, and Glenn Campbell was one of the greatest guitar players ever hold an instrument, and so underrated. And then the second place it occurred was on a Peter, Paul, and Mary album called Together 10 Years Together, or something like that. And then finally, it occurred on the Chet Atkins Alone album, which he played it on a gut string guitar. And so there was and a fourth version was Joe around the house singing it. He played the Bob Dylan version of it, right? And so it was everywhere around me, and I had all these different versions being played, and it was coagulating in my head, and so I obviously went right for Chet. And I had so many versions of it. It was easy for me to go to the Chet version and learn that one, and that's what I did. And that was sort of the first tune. There was one I experimented with prior to that one, which was from, which actually that might have happened a little bit later on. But I started to get Chet records for my birthdays and my Christmas presents from Dad and brothers, and there was another album that came a little bit later on, possibly in the same year, the same Christmas. That was Chet and Jerry Reed together, and they did a tune called Nashtownville, which was a pretty simple little tune in the key E, and or A, actually. It starts in E. But that one I took apart as well, but "Blowin' in the Wind" was the one that really got me. And that's the one I probably put the most time into when I first started playing fingerstyle guitar. And, I mean, on and on it goes. So it just one thing led to another, and you have to understand that these things were happening at a great rate of speed. I would learn something in a week, and the next week it would move on to another tune. So there was sometimes 50 to 100 things each year coming into my repertoire and coming into my head, because I just kept eating it. I just ate it like candy. I couldn't stop myself. And of course, a lot of that goes back to, some of the darkness that was in the household, and I was escaping from that. So the guitar became a refuge, and the more I learned, the brighter it made my life, and the more pleasant it made my interactions, even with my own family, and later on, that the public would become involved in it, and. But I'll tell you, Chet Atkins, I'm probably going to end up mentioning that man about 1,000 times during this series, just because of like I said, it's immeasurable. There's no way to even quantify what he did for me and about a million other guitar players, like what his music created in all of us. He created a whole generation of guitar players, and he did it for 50 years. It's just mind-boggling. I wish I could do 1% of what he achieved. I would be happy with just that. That would be, an amazingly high pinnacle to just get that much, and we're still trying to figure out what he did, and I am too. Like, all of us. I think I listen to Chet probably every other day, or like every time my iPod is playing or my phone's playing music. There's always a Chet thing that comes across the shuffle, and it's just as fresh, and it takes me back to the very beginning, and which was, in those days, as bad as things were, with my mom and dad and all the weird, messed up things that were going on. That part of life was so much joy, and Chet was definitely the main purveyor of that joy for me. I loved that man. He was a great man.